Aloha and good morning or good afternoon, whatever time you're listening to this. My name is Mila, although my full name is Cabrera Arce, and I am here to talk to you today about human and sex trafficking. So this is not something that a lot of people really like to take into consideration in their lives, but it's something that we need to start taking into consideration because it affects us in a million different ways and from a million different angles. It's not something that you've gone through your life without experiencing, whether you noticed it or not. Since you've already watched the TED Talks, I'm not going to get into that much more than that. But I do want to take the time to talk to you today about the causes of sex trafficking, the environmental causes, the social causes, the reasons that it happens. Because this was a big question I couldn't help but ask myself. Why are there people being trafficked? Why are there women that have to sell their bodies? There are multiple different reasons why trafficking happens in our world, and it happens everywhere, not in Hawaii, in the United States, all around the globe. There are certain places where it's more common than others, but no matter where you are, it does happen. So to begin this conversation, I'm going to talk about poverty. Poverty is one of the biggest reasons that sex trafficking occurs. Poverty can drive you to become a trafficker, as well as it can drive you to sell family members, your children, or even people you don't even really have a familial connection to. A lot of these situations, the parents or uncles or aunts, whoever the person selling their loved ones are, don't necessarily know that they're selling their loved ones into trafficking. In some places they do, but in most cases they don't. They're promised this amazing life. They're promised money back to the family. They're promised things that they need. And so they take that step and they trust in someone who they shouldn't. And then their child, granddaughter, niece, nephew ends up getting sold into the human trafficking industry, whether that's for labor or for sex. Another big reason that this happens has to do with a lack of education. A lack of education can lead to decreased opportunities for work at a living wage, essentially meaning that since you're not educated, you can't make a lot of money. So it leads you to poverty, which can lead into you selling your nieces and nephews, or again, becoming a trafficker, as well as when you aren't educated, you don't necessarily have the knowledge of your human rights, so you're more likely to be unaware of how you can handle yourself or your children or your family. So someone can much more easily convince you into doing what is essentially very illegal and very wrong. Demand for cheap labor and demand for sex is another massive reason. Without a demand, there wouldn't be a supply. So we live in a world where the cheaper, the better, whether it's for sex and pornography or for food or for the case for your AirPods that you really want, like anything you can think of. We live in a quantity over quality time period. So cheaper labor, essentially slave labor, is the cheapest labor you can get, human trafficking. So in addition to that, commercialized sex is a big thing, especially in this country. You see it on billboards, you see it on TV ads, you see it on the TV shows you watch, even in TikTok. Like half of these dances are extremely sexualized, which all leads to this want and this need for sex. And a lot of people can't just go on a Tinder app, or they don't know how, or they don't have the looks for it, or they're on a business trip and they want to feel fancy. So they buy a prostitute who more than half the time, is pimped out. It's not their choice, Another big reason has to do with a lack of human rights for vulnerable groups. So vulnerable groups, marginalized groups, local people of Hawaii are the most targeted, right? They're not going to go after the rich white woman who has 1,000 lawyers behind her. That happens, don't take me wrong. But the most common form of trafficking you see is in these high poverty, lower marginalized, lesser educated groups of people. Traffickers prey on marginalized groups. It's sadly how it works. In addition, although it's not something as first world people would like to consider, In a lot of cultures, it's culturally acceptable and it's the cultural norm. Again, if you live in poverty, or even if your whole group, like society or culture, just happens to do that, it can be quite common for people who have multiple children and are poor, or just need the money, or are seeking an opportunity, for them to sell off their children or their nieces and their nephews because they need it. It's hard to understand, but it's something that happens. Cultural factors and cultural practices are a big part of that, because especially once it's socially acceptable, just like a lot of things in our society that aren't socially acceptable in other societies, it's hard to realize that it's wrong, as weird as that sounds to people like us. Conflict and natural disasters are a big thing that causes human trafficking, or sex trafficking. So if there's a war going on, if there's a conflict, you're fleeing, you're going to different places, which makes you more vulnerable to being trafficked. You are looking for opportunities in places outside of your home, in places where you don't speak the language, you don't understand what's normal and what's not. Again, that makes you a lot more vulnerable to being trafficked, not practiced. And in addition to that, natural disasters, same kind of thing going on. If there's a massive hurricane or things like that, people are going to be desperate for money. They're going to be desperate for resources. They're going to be desperate to leave their home. And all of that is the perfect bundle, which leads to vulnerability, which leads to, again, human and sex trafficking. Another way that's interesting to think about it is not just conflict in war zones, but conflict in high violence zones like Mexico, or in El Salvador, or in places like that. You are using third world parties to come into different countries. So safe migration options, another big reason, right? You're trusting someone who you don't know to take you across countries, whether that's in the back of a dark truck, or being walked through the desert, or being hidden in a cargo plane, all these other options, to bring you into a country and then leave you there or guide you to wherever they promise to do. Well, a lot of these people who make these promises are traffickers. So as soon as you show up, or even as soon as they get you, they take your passport, they take your information, and then you have no identification. You are no longer a person. You are who they tell you are. And it can be really intimidating when they know who your family is, they know where you live, and they threaten. They use a lot of different tactics to get you to stay. And if you're a young girl or you're a young child and they're threatening your family, or they're threatening your life, or they're beating you, it's difficult to leave that. I do want to clarify that it's not the only way trafficking happens, where they're threatening you. There are other forms, such as boyfriending, but that's something that we can get into on another point. Another large reason, or another cause of sex and human trafficking, has to do with the fact that trafficking, sadly, generates a very large profit. So if you're a trafficker, you're going to make a ton of money doing it. You are selling human bodies. They are not cheap. You are selling human labor that is not cheap. You can make a ton of profit in ways, well, like we were discussing earlier, with cheap labor. Whether you're looking at it at a pimp or for work, if you have a farm, and you have 150 migrant workers, and you're either not paying them at all or paying them 50 cents an hour, that's going to be a lot cheaper than having legal documented people working for you, where you're having to pay the minimum wage of 10 plus an hour, plus the fact that you have to keep in mind their rights and all these other things, because they know what's going on, when it comes into sex slavery and trafficking, a lot of pimps or people like that, they don't give their workers any of money most of the time. They get to keep all the money, and they actually require them a minimum of workers. So they say, whatever you're doing tonight, you need to come back with $1,500. So in Hawaii, the typical is $100 for 30 minutes, which means over 10 to 15, if not even more partners in a single night. You're coming home to your pimp, your John, whoever, you're giving them all your money, and if you're lucky, and if you're still in that stage, they're buying you pretty clothes, they're buying you pretty things, and you don't have an option for it. It's just how it goes. So finally, the big one is traffickers. We couldn't have human or sex trafficking without traffickers. It's a horrible trade. Absolutely terrible. Who is born and thinks, you know what, when I grow up, I want to be a trafficker? Nobody. At least that I could imagine. But it happens. Traffickers are those who choose to exploit people for their own gain. Whether they do it because they're poor and they need the money, whether they do it because they were trafficked themselves at one point and they just grew up as this is the norm. While there are a lot of reasons why traffickers get into it, they're still making the willful decision to sell human beings for their own profit. And it's not okay. And as soon as we can really attack traffickers and get down to the root cause, this problem is going to continue happening in our day-to-day lives.